The Arizona desert stretched endlessly beneath a ruthless sun, a sea of heat waves blurring the horizon into shimmering gold. Dust devils danced between the shooting lanes of Camp Resolute, a Marine Corps sniper training ground carved into the dry earth. The wind howled low across the barren expanse, unpredictable and wild, the kind of wind that tested even the most disciplined shooters. Sergeant Jack Mitchell stood with his arms crossed, his shadow barely clinging to the ground beside him. His men, 12 of the finest Marine snipers from across the country, lay prone behind their rifles, their faces half hidden by scopes and sweat. Each breath they took was measured, each movement precise. These were men who prided themselves on perfection. But today, perfection was nowhere to be found. "Shooter 1, send it," Mitchell commanded. The first sniper exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and crack. The echo of the shot rolled through the canyons. Dust puffed up 2 inches right of the target. A miss. Mitchell clenched his jaw. Adjust and fire again. Another breath, another round. Crack, still off. Shooter 2, go. One by one, the Marines took their turns. Each shot missed by an inch, a foot, or worse. The sound of bullets cutting through dry air became a rhythm of failure. Targets downrange remained stubbornly untouched. The metallic clang they all longed to hear never came. Mitchell walked down the line, boots grinding into the coarse dirt. "These are stationary targets, gentlemen. The wind isn't your enemy. Your pride is." His voice was sharp, but strained with disbelief. He'd trained snipers in Afghanistan, Iraq, and beyond. He'd seen rookies shake under fire and veterans steady their hands while chaos burned around them. But never had he seen his top shooters miss every single shot. Something was wrong, not just with their aim, but with their rhythm, their focus. "Recalibrate your optics," one corporal muttered, shaking his head. "Already did," another replied, frustration thick in his voice. "It's the damn crosswind. It shifts every shot." Mitchell squinted toward the ridgeline. The wind had always been unpredictable here, but not this chaotic. It seemed to twist and whip at random, bending bullets off their path like some desert trickster. "Range control says gusts up to 25, the spotter reported. "But they're changing direction every 30 seconds. "Then read it better," Mitchell growled. Hours dragged on. The sun slid lower, bleeding orange into the sand. Sweat-stung eyes, tempers flared, and rifles grew hot to the touch. No matter how carefully they adjusted for distance and wind, the shots refused to land true. It wasn't just a bad day, it was humiliation. The Marines prided themselves on calm under pressure, but now even discipline was cracking. One slammed his fist into the ground. Another cursed the wind. "Sir, this is useless," said Corporal Henson, lowering his rifle. "We're burning ammo for nothing." Mitchell turned on him. "You think the enemy waits for good weather? You think the battlefield's gonna hand you perfect conditions?" Henson bit his tongue, nodding silently, but the sting of failure lingered. By late afternoon, the air shimmered with heat, and the scent of gunpowder hung heavy. The silence after each miss grew longer, heavier, until it wasn't just the wind mocking them anymore. It was their own disbelief. Mitchell lifted his radio. "Cease fire. Range cold." The command echoed through the dust. The men slowly stood, stretching stiff limbs, wiping sweat from brows. Some avoided eye contact altogether. No one wanted to meet the sergeant's gaze. Mitchell ran a hand over his stubbled chin, frustration gnawing at him. These were elite snipers, handpicked for skill and composure. How could they all fail at once? Was there a flaw in the rifles? A miscalibration in the scopes? He personally inspected the equipment. Everything was perfect. Everything except their performance. "Pack up," he ordered finally. "We'll reset tomorrow." Same time, same targets. And next time, his voice hardened, I want results. The Marines dispersed in silence, gathering their gear. The sound of spent brass being collected clinked softly against the ground. Mitchell remained behind, watching the horizon fade into a haze of amber light. His mind refused to rest. Something felt off, something he couldn't put his finger on. He glanced downrange. The target stood untouched, distant silhouettes laughing back at him through the mirage. A whisper of wind brushed past, carrying dust across his boots. He watched it curl, change direction, then vanish into nothing. It's not the men, he thought. It's the wind. But how could they fight an enemy they couldn't predict? He sighed and turned back toward camp, unaware that someone was watching him from the edge of the lot. A figure leaning casually against a dusty pickup truck parked near the supply station. The person was small, almost unnoticeable amid the trucks and equipment. A woman, her hair tied back under a faded ball cap, her hands resting on her hips as she quietly observed the scene from afar. Her expression wasn't mocking or curious. It was thoughtful, as if she understood something the Marines didn't. Mitchell barely glanced her way as he passed, assuming she was just another civilian worker. The base often had contractors, cooks, or local helpers dropping off supplies. But as he disappeared toward the barracks, the woman remained where she was, eyes fixed on the distant range. Downrange, the wind shifted again, a soft leftward curl. She smiled faintly. Fighting it, she murmured, almost to herself. They're fighting it the wrong way. The sun dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. The desert cooled slightly, though the air still hummed with the heat of the day. The range, now empty, felt haunted by the echoes of missed shots and broken confidence. Inside the camp, Mitchell's men ate in silence. Laughter that usually filled the mess hall was absent. Even the sound of utensils seemed heavy. Sergeant Mitchell sat apart, reviewing data on his clipboard. He tracked bullet spreads, wind measurements, elevation angles, every detail that might explain their failure. But no formula could solve what was happening out there. He rubbed his temple, weary and frustrated. The best shooters in the corps, he thought. And we can't hit a still target. As he stood to leave, one of the cooks came by with a tray. Long day out there, Sarge? She asked kindly. You could say that, Mitchell muttered. Wind's been wild today, she said, glancing toward the range. Hard to aim straight in that. Mitchell gave a humorless chuckle. Yeah, tell me about it. She smiled softly. Sometimes you can't aim through the wind. You have to aim with it. He looked up sharply, surprised by the phrasing, but she'd already walked off, humming softly. For a brief moment, her words echoed in his mind. Aim with the wind. He shook it off and stepped outside. The desert night was falling fast, stars flickering to life across the darkening sky. The wind carried a cool whisper now, more gentle than before. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes howled. Mitchell took one last look toward the range, now swallowed in shadow. Tomorrow, he told himself, they'd figure it out. They had to. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the solution wouldn't come from within his ranks. Something or someone was about to change everything they knew about shooting, precision, and pride. And that someone, he would soon discover, wasn't a Marine at all. Morning in the desert came slowly, like light creeping through a locked door. The first rays of sun spilled over the ridge and painted the Marine base in muted gold. Wind swept across the range, carrying the faint smell of dust and oil. It was another training day, another chance to prove themselves or fail again. Sergeant Jack Mitchell was already up before dawn, coffee in hand, boots sinking into the cold sand as he stared at the target's downrange. He'd been awake half the night replaying yesterday's failures. Every bullet that missed still echoed in his mind. He was a man who believed in control, in systems and precision. Yesterday, control had slipped through his fingers like sand. "Morning, Sarge," said Corporal Henson, walking up beside him, rifle slung over his shoulder. His eyes were tired, but his posture was straight, Marine discipline holding him together. "Morning," Mitchell replied, his voice low. "We're changing approach today. Less focus on optics, more on rhythm. You're not machines. You feel the shot before you take it." "Yes, sir." The others began arriving one by one, their faces drawn, expressions somewhere between determination and dread. Every man knew what was expected: redemption. By 0700 hours, the team was in position again. The air was cool, but a steady wind whispered from the north. Erratic, teasing. Mitchell studied it through the spotting scope. It shifted every few seconds, never long enough to rely on. "Same targets," he called. 500 meters. "Show me you learned something." The first sniper lay prone, breathing slow, eyes locked on his target. He squeezed the trigger. Crack. The bullet whistled away, then thud. Hit dirt 3 inches low. Another miss. Mitchell didn't shout. He didn't have to. His silence was heavier than any reprimand. "Shooter 2, send it." Crack. Miss. "Shooter 3, crack." Wide right. The cycle continued, shot after shot. The frustration began creeping back like a familiar ghost. Each miss carved deeper into their pride. Then, as Mitchell turned toward his scope again, a noise broke through the tense rhythm, the low rumble of an approaching truck. A silver pickup rolled into the lot, kicking up a cloud of dust. The Marines barely looked up. Supply deliveries were routine, but this one stopped unusually close to the firing line. The driver's door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. She wasn't what anyone expected to see on a sniper range. Maybe in the base cafeteria or the motor pool, but not here. Clara Davis, 40-something, sun-browned skin, eyes sharp as glass. She wore jeans, scuffed boots, and a faded cap that read, "Davis Ranch Supply." In her truck bed were crates, coffee, canned goods, and what looked like fresh bread from town. She leaned casually against the tailgate, surveying the range like she'd done it 100 times before. One of the Marines, Private Lewis, grinned and elbowed his buddy. "Guess breakfast's here." Mitchell ignored the comment. Civilians weren't supposed to be this close during live fire, but the base supply runs often blurred those lines. Clara called out, "Sergeant Mitchell?" He turned, surprised she knew his name. "That's me. You the supply run from Buckeye?" "That's right," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Kitchen manager said to drop this off early. Didn't realize I'd interrupt a war zone." A few of the Marines chuckled under their breath. Mitchell gave a polite nod. No war zone. Just a training disaster. Her brows lifted slightly. "Looks that way." Mitchell frowned at the remark. Civilians usually didn't comment on Marine performance, especially not at a sniper range. But her tone wasn't mocking. It was observational, almost casual, like she'd seen something they hadn't. He turned back toward his men. "All right, reset targets. We'll go again in 15? Clara didn't leave. She leaned against her truck, arms folded, watching as the Marines adjusted rifles and checked their scopes. The wind gusted again, a playful, swirling breath that tugged at her hair. She squinted at the range, following the movement of the flags and the dust. There was a subtle rhythm to it, one that only someone who'd lived in this desert long enough could see. "Wind's dancing today," she murmured. Mitchell glanced at her, half curious. "You know something about shooting in the wind?" She smiled faintly. "A little. My daddy used to say, the desert doesn't like to be controlled. You can't force a bullet through her air. You have to listen to it. Mitchell chuckled softly. We've been listening. The problem is, she's not talking. She's talking, Clara said, her voice calm but sure. You're just not hearing her right. A few Marines exchanged amused looks. Civilians giving advice to Marine snipers wasn't exactly common. Mitchell decided to humor her. You shoot, ma'am? Clara shrugged. Used to. My father was a hunter. Grew up chasing coyotes and rabbits out near Gila Bend. Learned to shoot before I learned to drive. But I'm sure what you're doing here is a bit different. You could say that, Mitchell said with a small grin. But as he turned away, her next words stopped him. Not that different, she said quietly. A bullet doesn't care if you're hunting game or fighting wars. It only cares if you respect the air it flies through. Something about the simplicity of it struck him. Respect the air. Not control it. Not fight it. Respect it. He shook the thought off. She was just a supply driver, after all. But as he watched her eyes track the wind with uncanny precision, a flicker of doubt formed. 15 minutes later, the men were back in position. The sound of gunfire resumed, sharp, clean, and once again, futile. Dust plumes danced just shy of the targets. Every shot missed. Mitchell's patience thinned. He paced behind the line, barking small corrections, his voice rising above the echoing cracks of the rifles. Check your wind holds. Read the terrain. You're overcompensating. But nothing changed. The frustration built again, thick enough to taste. Then Clara spoke. Not loudly, just enough for him to hear. You're fighting the wind instead of reading it. Mitchell stopped. Slowly, he turned toward her. What did you say? She stepped closer, still keeping respectful distance from the shooters. You're adjusting too fast. The gusts are short. You're treating them like they're constant. The wind shifts at the ridge. You can see it in the dust, about 200 meters out. Mitchell stared at her. She was pointing exactly where he'd noticed the turbulence, the same area that had been throwing off their shots. You can see that? He asked, almost disbelieving. She nodded. It's not about seeing, really. It's about feeling. If you've spent your life out here, you start to know what the wind's about to do before it does it. Mitchell studied her for a moment, unsure whether to be impressed or skeptical. Then one of his men, Private Lewis, called out, Sarge, who's the Desert Whisperer? A few of the Marines laughed. Clara didn't seem offended. She just smiled and said softly, Try waiting 2 seconds longer before you pull. Let the gust settle. Mitchell frowned, but decided there was nothing to lose. Do it, he told Lewis. Lewis adjusted, waited. Crack. A pause. Then a sound none of them had heard all week, the clang of bullets striking steel. The Marines froze. Even Mitchell blinked, stunned. Clara didn't celebrate. She just nodded, almost as if she'd expected it. Told you, she said simply. And before anyone could speak again, she turned back toward her truck, wiping her hands on a rag. Mitchell watched her go, mind spinning. He wasn't sure what he'd just witnessed, luck, instinct, or something more. But one thing was certain. This woman wasn't ordinary. And before the sun set that day, he'd find out exactly how deep her understanding ran, and how one simple woman was about to change everything he knew about shooting. The next morning, the sun rose early and merciless. Heat shimmered across the Arizona desert like invisible fire. The air was thick with the smell of oil, sand, and frustration. At the range, the U.S. Marine snipers were already lined up again, their rifles gleaming in the light, their faces shadowed by fatigue and pride. Sergeant Jack Mitchell stood behind them, his expression carved in stone. Yesterday had ended with something he couldn't explain a single hit. achieved after a random suggestion from a civilian woman. One perfect clang that had shattered a week of misses. Coincidence or not, that sound had haunted him all night. The woman's words echoed in his head. You're fighting the wind instead of reading it. He told himself it was luck. A broken clock is right twice a day, after all. But deep down, something in her calm tone, something in the way she'd read the land, unsettled him. By mid-morning, Clara Davis was back again. Her truck rumbled across the lot, just as the men were unpacking ammunition crates. She waved to the supply clerk, and parked in the same spot as yesterday, close enough to see the range, far enough to stay out of trouble. Mitchell pretended not to notice her, but he did. Everyone did. The men whispered, smirking. There's your lucky charm, Private Lewis said quietly. Maybe she can bless the bullets again, another joked. Mitchell shot them a glare sharp enough to silence the laughter. Focus on your scopes, he ordered. Still, his eyes drifted toward her. She leaned against the tailgate, sipping coffee from a tin mug, eyes following the flow of dust, the sway of range flags, the slight ripple in the air that signaled invisible currents. She wasn't watching the men. She was watching the wind. Range hot, Mitchell barked. Shooter one, send it. Crack. The sound split the air. The bullet missed, just off the left edge of the target. Shooter two. Crack. Missed again. Shooter three. Crack. Nothing but dust. Mitchell felt the tension rise behind his ribs. His men weren't just missing, they were losing faith. Even the best marksmen in the country were beginning to look like amateurs. Behind him, Clara spoke quietly, almost to herself. You're all moving too fast. Mitchell turned. Excuse me? She met his eyes calmly. You're pulling before the wind settles. It's like trying to catch a fish while the water's boiling. He frowned. Ma'am, I appreciate the poetry, but this isn't fishing. She smiled faintly. No, but it's still patience. Some of the Marines chuckled. One muttered, next thing you know, she'd be writing fortune cookies. Mitchell raised a hand for silence. He was irritated, but curiosity tugged at him. There was something about the certainty in her voice that didn't sound like guessing. He took a breath and gestured toward her. All right, ma'am. You seem to know a lot about wind. Why don't you tell us what we're doing wrong? Clara hesitated. I didn't mean to interrupt your work. You already did, he said dryly. Might as well make it useful. A ripple of amusement moved through the men. Clara set down her mug and walked toward the firing line, her boots crunching softly against the dirt. Every Marine turned to watch the civilian woman crossing into their sacred territory, a range reserved for warriors and marksmen, not coffee-carrying strangers. When she reached the edge of the line, she knelt down beside one of the prone shooters, squinting toward the targets. You see that dust cloud? She asked, pointing. About halfway to your target? Yes, ma'am, the sniper replied cautiously. Now look again closely. Watch how it moves. The wind's not constant. It bends around that ridge and then splits in two directions. You're compensating for the wrong gust. The Marine blinked. He followed her finger and saw it just barely. The dust swirled differently where she pointed, almost imperceptible unless you knew what to look for. How do you see that? He asked quietly. I've been staring at desert wind for 40 years, she said simply. Mitchell folded his arms, skeptical but intrigued. So what do you suggest? Clara brushed her hands together. Stop reading your scopes for a minute. Close your eyes. Feel the direction of the wind. Listen to it. The Marines stared. One coughed awkwardly. Another snorted. Mitchell gave her a tight smile. Ma'am, we're Marines, not monks. Clara tilted her head. Maybe you should be both. For a moment, The men stood awkwardly still. Then, perhaps out of sheer exhaustion or blind curiosity, one Marine actually did what she said. He closed his eyes, felt the breeze on his cheek, adjusted slightly to the right, and waited. "Now," Clara said softly. Crack. The sound echoed downrange, followed by the sweet, metallic clang of a perfect hit. No one spoke. Mitchell's jaw tensed. He'd seen enough miracles in his life to recognize when one was happening. The shot wasn't luck. The timing, the angle, it all aligned exactly with her words. "How?" he started, then stopped himself. Clara smiled. "You've all got the skill," she said. "You just stopped trusting your instincts. You're trying to control what you should be understanding." Her words hung in the air like a lesson none of them wanted to admit they needed. "Understanding?" Mitchell repeated. "We're Marines. We measure, calculate, and execute." She nodded. "And that's why you're missing. You're overthinking something that should be felt." A long silence followed. The men didn't laugh this time. Something had shifted, a thread of respect woven into their skepticism. "Ma'am," one of the snipers said finally, "you ever think about teaching?" She chuckled softly. "No, I'm just a rancher's daughter who learned to survive out here." Mitchell studied her. He couldn't decide if she was incredibly lucky or genuinely brilliant. Either way, she'd done something no Marine instructor had achieved in a week. She'd broken through their wall of frustration. "Well," he said at last, "since you've already corrected my men, maybe you should show us how it's done." The men erupted in low laughter. The tension eased. Clara raised an eyebrow. "You want me to shoot?" Mitchell smirked. "If you're as good as your words, why not?" She hesitated, scanning the group. Their eyes gleamed with curiosity and doubt. Finally, she shrugged. "All right, Sergeant." One shot. Mitchell stepped aside, gesturing toward his own rifle on the stand. "Be my guest." Clara approached slowly, almost respectfully, like someone stepping into sacred ground. She lay down, adjusted the bipod, and settled her cheek against the stock. Her movements weren't textbook too fluid, too relaxed, but there was confidence in them. The men watched in silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. She took a long breath, exhaled slowly, and whispered, "Easy now." Crack. The steel target rang instantly, a clean, perfect hit. The range went silent. Not a sound, but the lingering echo of metal and desert air. Clara opened one eye, looked up at Mitchell, and said, "See? You don't fight the wind. You dance with it." Mitchell stared, speechless. The men broke into murmurs, half awe, half disbelief. One whispered, "Holy hell, she nailed it first try." Mitchell finally spoke, his tone softer now. "Who are you, ma'am?" She smiled. "Just someone who learned from the land instead of a classroom." And with that, she handed the rifle back to him, brushed the dust from her jeans, and walked toward her truck, leaving 12 stunned Marines and one humbled instructor behind. The desert wind swirled again, whispering through the targets. This time, it didn't feel like mockery. It felt like it was laughing with them, or maybe with her. The air hung still after the echo of Clara's shot faded into the desert. Every Marine on the line stood frozen, caught between disbelief and admiration. The steel plate downrange still quivered from her hit, sunlight flashing off it like a beacon of truth. Sergeant Jack Mitchell lowered his binoculars slowly, trying to process what he had just seen. He'd trained snipers for over a decade. He'd seen prodigies, natural shooters, and the best of the best, but none had ever read the wind with such casual precision. He looked at Clara, who was now brushing off her hands as if she'd merely closed a gate on her ranch. "Ma'am," he called, voice half challenging, half respectful, You realize you just embarrassed a whole platoon of Marine snipers. Clara chuckled lightly. Didn't mean to. I just listened. Mitchell's jaw tightened. Listening's not a shooting technique. She tilted her head. Isn't it? Listening to the wind, the breath, the world around you. Isn't that the difference between guessing and knowing? The words hit him harder than he wanted to admit. He stared at her. The weathered skin, the simple clothes, the steady eyes, and for the first time in days, he saw someone who wasn't competing with the desert. She was in sync with it. Behind him, Corporal Davis, one of his top marksmen, muttered, "Sir, permission to ask her for another demo?" Mitchell sighed. "You're all serious about this?" "Yes, sir," Davis replied. "If she can teach us something, we'd be stupid not to learn." Mitchell folded his arms. A week ago, the idea of a civilian teaching Marines how to shoot would have been laughable. But now, his men were listening, really listening, for the first time since the exercise began. He turned back to Clara. "All right. You've got our attention. Care to show us again?" Clara smiled faintly. "I'll show you something, but only if you do it with me." The Marines exchanged glances. "With you, ma'am?" She nodded. "You shoot first. I'll guide." Mitchell gestured toward Corporal Davis. "You heard the lady. Take the shot." Davis dropped prone, setting his rifle into position. His heart thumped louder than his breath. He didn't want to miss, not in front of her. Clara crouched beside him, eyes on the horizon. "Now, don't think about hitting the target. Think about the wind as your partner. Feel it, don't fight it." Mitchell rolled his eyes, but stayed silent. Davis took a slow breath, focusing on the rustling of sand, the brush's sway, the faint whistle past his ear. Clara whispered, "Now, left side stronger. Adjust half a click right." He obeyed. "Hold your breath. And wait for the lull. It's coming." 3, 2, crack. The steel plate sang again. Another hit. A cheer broke out behind him. A sound that had been missing for days. Mitchell lifted his binoculars and smiled despite himself. "Well, I'll be damned." Clara stood, shading her eyes. "See? The wind isn't your enemy. It's your signal." Private Lewis grinned. "Can we call her the Wind Whisperer now?" Laughter rippled across the line. The good kind, the kind that broke tension instead of building it. Clara shook her head. "No titles. Just pay attention." Mitchell couldn't help but laugh quietly. The woman had done in 10 minutes what the Marine Corps manual hadn't in a week. She'd given them their confidence back. As the afternoon wore on, Clara stayed with them, explaining, showing, adjusting. She taught them how to see wind in the shimmer of heat, how to measure drift by watching tumbleweeds, how to sense shifts by sound instead of numbers. The Marines, to their credit, listened like students in awe. One after another, they started hitting targets at distances they'd been missing all week. By sunset, the once frustrated range had transformed into something else, a place of focus, laughter, and respect. Mitchell stood behind Clara, arms crossed, watching his men hit target after target. He finally said quietly, "You know, ma'am, the Corps has been teaching sniping for over 100 years. But not once did I hear anyone say, 'Listen to the wind.'" Clara smiled. "That's because you trained to master the rifle. I learned to understand the land. There's a difference." He nodded slowly. "You ever consider joining the Corps? You'd make one hell of an instructor." She chuckled. "I'm too old to take orders. Besides, your boys don't need another Marine. They just needed a reminder that the desert's not something to beat, it's something to know." Mitchell studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. "Still, I'd be honored if you'd come back tomorrow. Train with us, officially." She looked at his hand, then out toward the darkening desert. "I'll think about it," she said softly. The next morning, she returned, not because she had to, but because something in those young men's faces had stirred her. They were soldiers, yes, but also students of the earth now. The day began the same way. Rifles lined up, wind flags fluttering, sun burning red over the horizon. But the mood was different. There was purpose. There was belief. Mitchell briefed them quickly, then turned to Clara. "Wind Whisperer, you're up." She shot him a mock glare. "Don't start that, Sergeant." "Too late," he smirked. "It's already a legend." She laughed and walked forward. "All right, boys. Let's see if you remembered yesterday's lesson." One by one, the Marines took their shots. One by one, the targets rang. It wasn't perfect. Some shots still missed, but something deeper had shifted. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were feeling it. Mitchell leaned toward her quietly. "You've changed them." She smiled without looking away from the range. "No, Sergeant. They changed themselves. I just opened their eyes." Later that afternoon, the commanding officer, Colonel Raymond Briggs, arrived unannounced. His sharp eyes scanned the line, noting the improved performance. He called Mitchell aside. "What the hell happened here? Yesterday, you were missing every target." Mitchell hesitated. "We got some outside help, sir." "Outside help?" The colonel frowned. "From who?" Before Mitchell could answer, Clara appeared beside them, tipping her hat. "Afternoon, Colonel." Briggs blinked. "And you are?" "Clara Davis, sir," Mitchell said. "Local rancher. Seems she knows a thing or two about wind." Briggs stared at her, then at the targets. "You're telling me she fixed your sniper problem?" Mitchell nodded. "You could say that." Briggs studied her quietly for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled. "Well, Miss Davis, if you ever get tired of ranching, the Marine Corps could use you." Clara chuckled. "I'll keep that in mind, sir." Briggs turned back toward the targets. "Carry on, Sergeant. And Miss Davis, stick around for a while. I want to see this miracle for myself." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert gold, the snipers kept firing. Every shot a little sharper, every hit a little sweeter. And in the midst of them stood a simple woman who had done the impossible, not by changing their rifles, but by changing the way they saw the world around them. The desert, once their enemy, had become their ally. And Sergeant Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that fate had brought Clara there for a reason, one they hadn't yet seen. The following morning broke colder than usual. The desert, unpredictable as always, had traded its furnace heat for a cutting chill that bit through every layer of uniform. The Marines gathered early, their breaths fogging in the dawn air, anticipation buzzing through the group like static. Colonel Raymond Briggs stood at the edge of the range, his boots planted firm, his expression unreadable. He was a man of order, a living embodiment of military precision, the kind who didn't believe in luck or folklore. And yet, he couldn't deny what he'd witnessed yesterday. Targets that had remained untouched for days now sang with every shot. His Marines, once frustrated, now moved with rhythm and control. The improvement was impossible to ignore, and for a man like Briggs, impossible to fully accept without testing it himself. Clara Davis stood beside Sergeant Jack Mitchell, wrapped in her worn brown jacket, a mug of coffee steaming in her hands. She looked perfectly calm, as though she wasn't standing among elite snipers and brass officers, but rather on her own porch, watching another sunrise. Briggs eyed her for a long moment before speaking. "Miss Davis, I'll be honest. I'm still trying to understand how a civilian walked into a Marine training range and turned my snipers into crack shots overnight." Clara smiled faintly. "It wasn't overnight, Colonel. They already had the skill. They just stopped fighting the wind." Briggs raised an eyebrow. You keep talking about the wind like it's a person. Clara shrugged. Maybe it is. It changes moods faster than any human I've met. Mitchell stifled a grin. He'd grown used to her quiet wit, but the colonel clearly hadn't. Briggs folded his arms. Well, Miss Davis, I've seen men claim miracles before, and I don't believe in them until they hold up under pressure. She took a sip of coffee. So you're planning a test? Briggs smiled thinly. Exactly. If you're truly as gifted as these Marines seem to think, I want you to prove it under combat simulation conditions. Mitchell frowned. Sir, that's not necessary. She's already proven. Briggs cut him off. Not to me, she hasn't. Clara's gaze drifted toward the range. What kind of test are we talking about, Colonel? He gestured toward the horizon. 5 targets, all steel. Distances between 800 and 1,200 yards. The wind's unpredictable, the terrain uneven. You'll have to move between positions, just like a sniper in the field. She raised an eyebrow. And you want me to do this with one of your rifles? Briggs nodded. Standard Marine M40A6. No custom scopes, no help, no adjustments. Mitchell's voice was tense. Sir, with respect, that's extreme even for trained snipers. I'm aware, Briggs said sharply. That's why it's a fair test. The air went still. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if curious about what would happen next. Clara stared at the long stretch of desert. The targets were barely visible specks against the golden sand. She knew the kind of challenge this was, the kind meant to make her fail. But something in her heart stirred. She wasn't doing this for pride. She was doing it for the men who'd finally started believing again. All right, she said softly. I'll do it. Mitchell turned to her, concern flickering across his face. Clara, you don't have to prove anything to him. She smiled faintly. Maybe not to him, but to myself? Maybe I do. Briggs gestured to a table. Your rifle's ready. You'll have 30 minutes. Each target must be hit once, no retries. Clara walked over, picked up the rifle, and ran her hand along the barrel like she was greeting an old friend. The weight was familiar, though heavier than what she was used to. She dropped into a prone position, scanning the range. The Marines stood behind, watching in silence. This wasn't just a test for her. It was a test for everything she'd taught them. Mitchell crouched beside her, lowering his voice. You've got this. Trust your own advice. Dance with it. She smiled at that. Now you're starting to sound like me, Sergeant. Briggs raised his hand. Begin. The timer started. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in slowly. The cold air nipped at her face, but she didn't feel it. Her focus stretched out into the desert, listening, really listening, for the rhythm of the world around her. Then she opened her eyes and fired. Crack! A sharp clang answered her. First target hit. A murmur ran through the crowd. She shifted, crawling forward to the next position. Sand clung to her elbows and jacket, but she didn't care. Her hands were steady, her movements deliberate. Second shot, crack, clang. Another perfect hit. Colonel Briggs' face hardened, but his eyes betrayed surprise. The wind shifted. A swirl of dust lifted to her right, changing direction twice in seconds. She waited, patient, poised. Then, just as it calmed, she fired again. Third target clang. Mitchell exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The Marines behind him were whispering now, disbelief turning to admiration. Clara adjusted once more, crawling toward a slight incline for the fourth shot. The ground was rough, the wind now whipping in bursts. She watched the distant brush sway erratically. This one wouldn't be easy. She whispered to herself, All right, old friend. Let's see what you're hiding. She watched for the pattern, the pause between gusts, the moment when the desert drew breath before exhaling again. When it came, she squeezed the trigger. Crack! The bullet sliced through the shifting air, and a heartbeat later, clang. 4 down. Even Briggs blinked this time. His men were grinning openly now. The final target was over 1,000 yards away, half obscured by a low ridge. The wind howled harder than before, pulling at her hair and kicking up dust around the muzzle. Mitchell leaned forward. "You can skip it, Clara. You've proved your point." She smiled without looking back. "Not until it's done." She lowered herself again, feeling the earth beneath her. Every grain of sand, every gust of air spoke to her, not as obstacles, but as old companions. She waited, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Then crack! The sound echoed across the valley. For a moment, there was silence. Then, faint but clear clang. The 5th target rang. The range erupted in cheers. Marines threw their fists into the air. Mitchell laughed out loud, shaking his head in disbelief. Briggs stood motionless, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the distant steel plate, still vibrating in the sun. Slowly, he turned toward Clara. She stood, dusting off her jacket, expression calm but proud. "Well, Colonel?" He stared at her for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "Miss Davis. That's one hell of a display." "Not a display," she said softly. "Just the wind doing its job." For the first time, the hard, stoic colonel smiled. "Maybe so. But the wind's never passed my test before." Mitchell clapped a hand on Clara's shoulder. "Told you, sir. She's the real deal." As the Marines crowded around, cheering and patting her on the back, Clara looked out across the vast desert, where the wind danced freely once again. She'd come there as a stranger, a simple woman with a rancher's hands and a quiet wisdom. But now, even the toughest soldiers in the United States Marine Corps looked at her with the kind of respect reserved for legends. And somewhere deep inside, she couldn't help but smile, not out of pride, but because she'd proven something that went beyond rifles and bullets, that sometimes the greatest teachers aren't trained by institutions or rank, but by life itself. The colonel's test was over, and the legend of the woman who taught Marines to listen to the wind had just begun. 2 days after Clara's astonishing performance, the desert base was buzzing with a kind of pride it hadn't felt in months. The Marine snipers were no longer just training, they were thriving. Every shot now carried confidence, every movement purpose. The clang of steel targets had become the heartbeat of the camp. Sergeant Jack Mitchell watched his men with a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. They were different now, calmer, sharper, more connected to their surroundings. And it all started with one woman who had never been part of the Corps, who didn't carry rank or weapon by tradition, but carried something far greater, understanding. Clara Davis had returned to the range each morning since the colonel's test. She didn't act like an instructor. She just observed, occasionally walking behind a line of prone shooters, offering soft, almost motherly corrections. Breathe slower. Don't force it. Wait for the pause the wind always exhales. Don't rush the land. Let it tell you when it's ready. The Marines listened like disciples. Every word from her seemed to strip away the mechanical and bring out something instinctive in them. By noon, the targets were peppered with hits. Mitchell felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. For once, everything was perfect. Then the dust trails appeared in the distance. 3 military Humvees rolled toward the range, kicking up clouds that shimmered under the midday sun. Their arrival broke the calm like a crack of thunder. Mitchell narrowed his eyes. We weren't expecting visitors. Colonel Briggs, standing nearby, folded his arms. We are now. The vehicle stopped, and a group of men stepped out, 6 of them, in desert camo, carrying sniper rifles, marked with a different insignia. Their patches read, 2nd Recon Sniper Division, Camp Pendleton. Leading them was Captain Ryan Harlow, a tall, broad-shouldered Marine with the sharp, confident air of someone used to being the best in the room. "Colonel Briggs," Harlow said as he approached, his tone clipped. "Heard rumors that your boys turned into deadeyes overnight. Thought I'd come see what kind of magic you're running out here." Briggs met his gaze evenly. "No magic, Captain. Just good training." Harlow smirked. "Funny. My men say yours couldn't hit sand if they fell off a dune last week. Now they're apparently shooting like legends. Sounds like magic to me." Mitchell stepped forward, voice firm. "We've just been learning to listen to the land, sir." Harlow raised an eyebrow. "The land, huh? That what they're calling luck these days?" Before Mitchell could reply, Clara's voice came from behind. "Not luck, Captain. Just understanding." Every Marine turned. Clara stood calmly near the shade tent, her brown jacket fluttering lightly in the wind. She looked so out of place among the rigid uniforms and rifles, yet her presence seemed to command the air itself. Harlow blinked. "And you are?" "Clara Davis," she said simply. Harlow chuckled. "Don't tell me this is your secret weapon." Mitchell's eyes flashed. "You do well to show respect, Captain." But Clara only smiled. "It's all right, Sergeant. Let him think what he likes. Wing doesn't care who believes in it." That drew a few smirks from Mitchell's men. Harlow crossed his arms. "Well, Miss Davis, if you're the reason these boys can shoot again, maybe you'll let me see how good your wind wisdom really is." Briggs frowned. "Captain, this isn't a circus. On the contrary, sir," Harlow interrupted, "I think this could be valuable training. A friendly inter-base challenge. My snipers versus yours. Same conditions, same distance. Winner takes the bragging rights." Briggs looked at Mitchell, then at Clara. She met his eyes and gave a small, confident nod. "All right," Briggs said. "We'll allow it." Within the hour, both teams were in position. Targets were reset 5 steel plates each, ranging from 800 to 1,200 yards. The wind, as if sensing the tension, picked up into restless waves that curled through the range. Captain Harlow smirked across the field. "You can start, Sergeant. Let's see what your little class in poetry did for you." Mitchell nodded to his men. "Positions." The Marines dropped prone, settling into their rifles. Clara moved among them quietly, like a calm breeze in human form. She stopped behind Private Lewis. "The wind's teasing you today. Don't let it rush you. Watch the brush, see how it bends twice before it rests? That's your window." He nodded, focusing hard. Crack, clang. The first target went down. Cheers erupted. Then another. And another. Within minutes, Mitchell's team had scored 4 out of 5 hits, each one clean, controlled, confident. Captain Harlow's smile faltered slightly, but he clapped his hands. "Impressive. Now let's see how the real snipers do it." He gestured to his men. "Show them how Pendleton handles wind." The rival team took position, their movements precise and disciplined. They fired one after another, each shot cutting through the air with mechanical perfection. But something was off. Crack. Miss. Crack. Miss. They hit only 2 of 5 targets. The wind had turned unpredictable again, dancing across the field like it was toying with them. Harlow's jaw clenched. He adjusted his own scope, preparing to show them how it was done. Mitchell's team stepped back, watching silently. Clara, standing to the side, glanced at the range. The dust wasn't flowing straight, it was twisting in spirals. "Don't shoot yet," she called out suddenly. Harlow froze mid-aim. "Excuse me?" She walked closer. "You'll miss. The dust is splitting right before the ridge." He sneered. I think I'll trust my instruments over folktales. He fired. Crack. Miss. Clara didn't say a word. She just looked toward the brush, calm as ever. Told you. The Marines from Mitchell's team stifled laughter. Even Colonel Briggs had to hide a smirk behind his hand. Harlow exhaled sharply, lowering his rifle. All right then, Miss Davis. Why don't you take the shot? Mitchell's men murmured in surprise. Briggs frowned. Captain, that's enough. But Clara stepped forward. No, it's all right. She lay down where Harlow had been, adjusted nothing but the angle of the rifle, and let the wind brush past her cheek. Then she squeezed the trigger. Crack, clang. The echo rolled across the desert like thunder. Another perfect hit. Silence fell over both teams. Clara rose slowly, brushed sand from her jacket, and said softly, "The wing doesn't follow your rules, Captain. You follow its." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, to everyone's surprise, Captain Harlow laughed a deep, genuine laugh. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Guess the desert chose its teacher." Mitchell grinned. "Told you, sir. The wind listens to her." Harlow extended his hand to Clara. "I don't know where you learned all that, ma'am, but I'll be telling this story for a long time." She smiled and shook his hand. "Don't tell it. Teach it." The two teams stood together as the sun began to dip, painting the desert gold and red. The rivalry melted into camaraderie. Marines from both divisions gathered around Clara, asking questions, eager to learn the language of the wind. Colonel Briggs looked out over the range, pride swelling in his chest. What had started as a challenge had turned into something far greater, a lesson in humility, unity, and respect for the unseen. And as the wind danced once more across the desert, whispering through the flags and brush, Clara Davis smiled quietly. Because for the first time, she knew they all finally understood what she'd been trying to teach them all along. You don't conquer nature. You become part of it. The next morning, the desert was unnaturally still. The range that usually rang with gunfire and laughter lay silent. The Marines of Bravo Company were gathered near the operations tent, their faces tense. The buzz of activity around the camp was different, sharp, urgent, purposeful. Sergeant Jack Mitchell stood beside Colonel Briggs, scanning the newly arrived chopper that kicked dust into the dawn. Two officers in tactical gear stepped out, carrying sealed mission folders. One of them, a stern-faced major with a voice like gravel, didn't waste a second. "Orders straight from Central Command," he said, handing Briggs the folder. "There's a situation near Al-Najim Ridge. Recon patrol went dark last night. Drone feeds show insurgents regrouping near an abandoned refinery. We need precision overwatch, long-range snipers only. No mistakes." Briggs opened the file, his eyes narrowing. "Wind's insane near that ridge," he muttered. "Visibility less than 40% after noon." The major nodded grimly. "Exactly why they called you." Mitchell stepped forward. "Sir, my men are ready." Briggs looked at him, then at the range behind them, the same one where, days ago, every bullet had gone astray. Now, his shooters were different. And he knew why. He turned to Clara, who had quietly approached, her jacket fluttering in the growing breeze. "You trained them for this without even knowing it," he said softly. She gave a faint smile. "The desert trained them. I just made them listen." Briggs hesitated for a moment and nodded. "Sergeant Mitchell, assemble your sniper team. Wheels up in 30. Within the hour, the Black Hawk lifted into the air, slicing through the burning sky. Inside, Mitchell's team checked and rechecked their rifles, scopes, and comms. The usual jokes and banter were gone. Only focus remained. Clara sat quietly near the back, helmet on, hands clasped. This was the first time she'd joined a combat deployment. She wasn't military, Officially, she wasn't supposed to be here at all. But Briggs had insisted. If the wind's half as bad as the reports say, he told her, I want the one person who can read it like a language on that ridge. Mitchell caught her gaze across the cabin. You ready for this? She smiled faintly. I don't know if anyone ever is. But the desert's the same no matter where you stand. He nodded. Then we'll make sure we stand with it. The chopper thundered over jagged cliffs and open valleys. The radio crackled with updates. Enemy positions, wind speeds, drone feed distortions. When they finally descended toward the ridge, the landscape stretched out in brutal beauty. Dunes broken by sharp rock and the crumbling silhouette of the old refinery ahead. Landing zone clear? Came the call. Bettine disembarked, boots crunching on the dry earth. The heat was staggering, and the air shimmered like glass. Mitchell scanned the horizon through his scope. Multiple ridgelines, minimal cover. We'll split into 2 teams. Harper and Lewis, east flank. Cooper and I'll take the west. Clara crouched beside him, studying the terrain. The wind's playing tricks, she murmured. See that dust trail near the refinery? It's moving opposite the flag's direction. You'll need to aim a full quarter off from normal drift. He adjusted his scope slightly. Copy that. They settled into position, crawling along the rocks, their rifles steady against the shifting wind. Through the scope, Mitchell could see faint movement, figures moving between rusted pipes and shattered concrete walls. The comms crackled. Target group confirmed. Hostile activity near the east fuel tanks. 3 spotted. Possible hostages. Mitchell exhaled. We've got eyes. He lined up his first shot, finger steady on the trigger, but then the wind shifted violently, slamming hot air against his cheek. He stopped. Clara crouched behind him, whispered, Wait. It'll breathe out again. The desert's inhaling. Don't fight it. Seconds ticked by. Then, the dust that had been swirling steadied into a soft drift. Now, she whispered. Crack, clang. The first insurgent dropped instantly. The others scrambled for cover, shouts echoing faintly in the distance. Harper's voice came through comms. Confirmed hit. Moving to secondary. Mitchell reloaded, heart pounding, eyes never leaving the scope. Another figure appeared near the refinery gate, raising a weapon. But before he could fire, Clara's voice cut through the comm. Hold fire. There's a gust split. You'll miss high, right? He paused, adjusted just half an inch down. Crack. The bullet struck dead center. Target neutralized, he said, calm but with a rush of disbelief. Even in combat, Clara's readings were flawless. It was like she could feel the unseen. Over the next 10 minutes, the Marines dismantled the ambush systematically, guided by Clara's uncanny sense of the desert's rhythm. When the last echo faded, the ridge was silent, except for the hum of the wind and the distant thump of rotors. Mission success, Mitchell reported. Hostiles down. Refinery secure. Cheers filled the comms, but they were brief. The wind suddenly shifted hard east, swirling violently. Dust clouds began to rise, swallowing the ridge in a choking storm. Sandstorm incoming. Someone yelled. Visibility dropped to nothing in seconds. The Marines huddled near the rocks, goggles tight, cloths over their mouths. Mitchell shouted over the roar. We're blind. Can't move without losing direction. Clara's voice was calm, barely raised. Stay low. The storm's pushing north. If we crawl along the wind's belly, it'll guide us out. The wind's belly? Harper yelled, incredulous. But Mitchell trusted her. Do it. They moved as she directed, staying close to the ground, each step fighting against the furious gusts. Clara led the way, eyes half closed, palms open as if feeling her direction rather than seeing it. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm eased. The air cleared, revealing the chopper circling back for pickup. They stumbled aboard, exhausted but alive. Inside, the Marines dropped their gear, their faces streaked with sand and sweat. Mitchell looked at Clara, still calm, her eyes reflecting the orange dusk through the window. "You saved us back there." She shook her head. "The desert did. It just told me which way it wanted to breathe." Colonel Briggs's voice came over the comm as the chopper banked toward base. "Outstanding work, Bravo team. Central Command just called. Your overwatch prevented a large-scale ambush. You brought them home." Mitchell leaned back, closing his eyes as the wind howled outside the rotors. He thought about how far they'd come, from missing every shot to mastering the impossible. Clara sat quietly across from him, her expression unreadable, but her lips curved just slightly. The faint, knowing smile of someone who'd seen the desert's heart and survived it. Outside, the sand swirled again, soft, rhythmic, almost like applause. For the first time, every Marine aboard understood what she'd been trying to teach them from the start. You don't fight the desert. You learn to listen to it. And tonight, the wind had listened back. The mission was complete. The desert lay quiet, bathed in the golden glow of sunset, the sky streaked with fiery orange and purple. Dust swirled gently over the range, no longer carrying the chaos of misfired bullets or tense comms. Instead, it danced lazily across the targets, whispering through the rocks and scrub brush, as if the desert itself was sighing in relief. Sergeant Jack Mitchell stood at the edge of the firing line, rifle in hand but unloaded, his eyes scanning the horizon. His men gathered around him, their faces sunburned and streaked with sand, their movements confident but tired. Today had been their final day of field exercises, but unlike the previous week, every Marine carried a quiet pride that had nothing to do with rank or medals. Clara Davis stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the sunset. She had been with them for more than a week now, guiding, teaching, and observing. The Marines had come a long way, but it wasn't just their marksmanship that had changed. It was the way they saw the world. They moved with patience, understanding, and a newfound respect for the forces they could neither control nor ignore. Mitchell turned toward her. "I still can't believe you showed up that first day. And now look at them. Every one of them can hit targets I'd have bet against last week." Clara smiled faintly. "They didn't need me to show them how to shoot. They needed me to remind them to listen." Behind them, the Marines were cleaning their rifles, chatting quietly among themselves. Some were joking softly, a sound that seemed almost foreign after the tense days of practice and mission prep. Others simply stared at the targets downrange, feeling the satisfaction of a job done right, their confidence hard-earned. Colonel Briggs approached, walking with measured steps, a rare smile touching his lips. "Sergeant Mitchell, Miss Davis," he said, pausing to look across the horizon. "I'll admit I doubted this whole setup. I thought perhaps your methods, unconventional as they were, might help them hit targets under controlled conditions. I did not expect real-world application to succeed like this." Clara shrugged. "The desert doesn't care about rank, sir. It only cares if you pay attention." Briggs nodded thoughtfully. "That's a lesson I think even the most experienced officers could learn." Mitchell glanced at Clara. "You're going to leave soon, aren't you?" She didn't answer immediately. She watched the horizon, letting the fading sun color her face. "Yes," she said quietly. "My life is here. My land, my ranch. This was never meant to be permanent." The Marines overheard, and a quiet murmur ran through the group. Even the toughest men looked a little surprised at the idea of saying goodbye. Private Lewis approached, helmet in hand, a little awkwardly. "Ma'am, I don't even know how to thank you. You didn't just teach us to shoot. You taught us to think. And maybe to trust ourselves." Clara reached out and gave him a gentle nod. "That's all I wanted. You already had it inside you. You just forgot to listen." Mitchell stepped closer. "You changed us, Clara. Not just here, on this range, but out there, on the ridge, during the mission. Your guidance saved lives. Every one of these men owes you more than they'll ever admit." She looked at him, her expression soft but resolute. "I didn't save anyone. I just helped them notice what was already there. You all did the work. I just whispered the truth of the land back to you." A silence fell over the group. Even the wind seemed to pause in respect. Then Colonel Briggs spoke again. "Miss Davis, on behalf of the course, I want to extend a formal thanks. I'd like to offer you a position as a civilian instructor." Clara shook her head. "I appreciate it, Colonel, but my life is elsewhere. My work is with the land. Teaching Marines was a gift, but it's time to return to my world." Mitchell's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed he might argue. But he knew better. Clara's time here had never been about recognition or permanence. It was about something larger, something invisible that she had given to them all. The Marines fell silent as she walked toward her truck. Each step was measured, calm, purposeful. Even as the desert wind kicked up behind her, she moved as if the air itself were bending around her, guiding her path. Private Cooper called out softly, "Ma'am, will we see you again?" Clara paused, looking back. Her eyes softened, a rare hint of warmth breaking through the calm. "The desert always listens," she said. "Maybe someday you'll hear me in the wind again." Then she climbed into her truck and started the engine. The vehicle rumbled like a heartbeat across the desert. Dust swirled behind it, a trail that shimmered gold in the fading sunlight. Mitchell watched until the dust settled, a mixture of awe and sadness knotting in his chest. The woman who had turned his team into legends, who had taught them the impossible, was leaving, and the desert would never be quite the same without her. He turned back to his men. "All right, listen up. What we learned here, what she taught us, it stays with us. Not just in our rifles, not just in our scores, but in the way we move, the way we think, the way we survive. That's the real lesson." The Marines nodded solemnly. They understood. Clara had left more than skill, more than guidance. She had left a legacy. Colonel Briggs stepped forward. "Sergeant Mitchell, keep these lessons alive. And remember, sometimes the greatest teacher doesn't wear a uniform. Sometimes she's just listening." Mitchell nodded. "Yes, sir." As night fell over the desert, the stars ignited one by one, brilliant and infinite. The wind whispered across the dunes, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible memory of a woman who had danced with the air and taught a platoon of Marines to do the same. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of Clara's truck faded into silence, leaving the desert and its soldiers alone together, forever changed. Mitchell raised his gaze to the horizon. "She was remarkable," he said quietly. One of the younger Marines nodded, voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, she showed us how to listen." And in that moment, every Marine understood. Not all heroes carry rifles. Some carry wisdom. And sometimes the simplest lessons, patience, observation, understanding, can turn the impossible into reality. The desert had spoken. And thanks to Clara Davis, the Marines had finally learned to hear it. The night deepened, cool and calm, and the desert stretched endlessly. Every rustle of sand, every sigh of the wind, seemed to whisper her name, a quiet reminder that her legacy would endure. Not in stories alone, but in every shot fired, every soldier trained, and every moment they remembered to listen. The legend of Clara Davis, the woman who taught Marines to hear the wind, had been written into the very heart of the desert, and it would never be forgotten.